Video games are often described as an escape. An easy concept to understand. The real world can suck. So whether it be as an Italian plumber from the Bronx or a post-apocalyptic mailman, we could all afford to escape from time to time. And through decades of innovation, there are seemingly infinite ways to make your escape. Whether through thought-provoking stories, a challenge, mindless arcade fun, life simulators, farm simulators, beloved characters, time spent with friends, or time spent making new ones from all over the world, there is something out there for everyone. Most media we consume attempting to make that escape. And while that's valuable enough on its own, I believe video games have become more than just your basic time killer. When 4 siblings are all under one roof for the holidays, for the first time in who knows how long, it's the games of Mario Party, where they catch up and laugh, that stick with them when they all go back to the regularly scheduled programming we all call life. Best friends who grow up and move away, only to reconnect through games like Fortnite, Rocket League, or whatever the next $100 million live service experiment ends up being. A father and son who bond over his son's favorite game because it was just turned into a TV show on his dad's favorite network, or even way back in the day when dad would let him help as he played through Driver 1 and 2. The controller was rarely plugged in, if ever, but those are memories that'll last a lifetime. And of course mom, who helped fund the collection growing up. These experiences are mine, and they only just scratch the surface of the fondest memories I've made through video games. Simply put, it's impossible for me to look back on some of these memories as just a brief escape or time that I killed. All of this to say, I concede, video games are no replacement for real-world pleasure. But when talking about what video games bring to the table, the whole may just be greater than the sum of its parts. It's not all puppies and rainbows, unless you're playing Nintendogs or racing Rainbow Road, in which case it would mostly be puppies and rainbows. I think those are more the exception than the rule. You know what? It doesn't matter. Throughout its history, you'll find controversy, cutthroat business maneuvers, brutal industry-wide collapses, the birth of multi-billion-dollar franchises, and enough discourse from players to fill up an entire world book encyclopedia. It's not perfect, and through the studying of its history, I've learned it never has been. But in 2025, I have never been more passionate about video games than I am right now. And while the industry itself remains in a state of volatility, I'd argue there's never been a better time to be a gamer than right now. But this series isn't about my opinion. This series is about how we got here. The products, the people who made them, the controversies, the evolutions of dozens of companies, along with the console wars they participated in. From the early days of the arcades to the high-end devices we use today, this is the history of video games. Our story begins in France, in the late 1700s, with the introduction of a new game. The origin story of this game is fuzzy at best, but as the legend goes, one fateful day in 1777, the Comte d'Artois held a party at the Château de Bagatelle in honor of his brother, King Louis XVI, and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. Those in attendance that day, lucky enough to have been invited to this exclusive banger, were about to have their worlds reshaped. Many claim it was at this party that a brand new table game would be introduced for the first time. Based on other ball-rolling games in Europe, and widely speculated to have been invented in France, that game was none other than Bagatelle. Using pool cues to shoot ivory balls down a sloped billiards table, players shot their balls at 9 different scoring pockets, trying to tally as many points before running out of balls. As time went on, different versions of the classic game were created, adding pegs that acted as penalties should you knock them over, or even pins fastened to the table that were used to deflect your shot in different directions. Eventually, Bagatelle would leave the chateau, becoming a big hit all over Europe and the United States. But how does a game invented in France, within the confines of the legendary Château de Bagatelle, make its way to US soil?
We're going to war.
When France aided in the Revolutionary War, some soldiers were said to have brought their Bagatelle games with them, and while unconfirmed, it's widely speculated that this is how Bagatelle made its way onto US soil for the first time. And while Bagatelle's initial forms seemed to satisfy the masses for decades, one man was going to come along and change the game, specifically, the game of Bagatelle. Montague Redgrave, a British inventor whose photograph is impossible to find, would move from England to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he would go on to make quite the dent in the industry. Redgrave got to work, filing a few patents for a steel ball and plunger along with a game he called Improvements in Bagatelle, a game I would have loved to see the marketing for. The plunger became a ball launcher, and the ivory balls changed to steel. In addition to this, he removed the wicket-style objects that scattered the board initially and replaced them with metal pins built into the table. All of these changes were shrunk into a smaller form factor and were welcome additions to a game that was quite literally an improved version of Bagatelle. Montague Redgrave, nothing if not a man who delivered on his word. If we are to believe the timeline as it's been presented, and believe me, the Bagatelle creation timeline is a fuzzy one, this game went 100 years before undergoing any major changes. And as trivial as a ball launcher and smaller form factor might seem, these innovations would play a big role in the eventual rise of pinball as a genre. But at this point, we're still a few decades away from the full-on pinball takeover. (1929) marks the beginning of the Great Depression. Regarded as the longest and most severe economic collapse to ever hit the industrialized world, it affected nearly every aspect of day-to-day life for the worse. In the years leading up to the Depression, a different type of cabinet game reigned supreme, if only for a little while. Referred to as novelty games or arcade pieces, these games often emulated sports, baseball being the most common, but other sports included English football, golf, horse racing, and a variety of grip testers were found in bars, speakeasies, and places like Playland Park. Speakeasies served as secret bars during this time period, as these games rose to prominence during a 13-year period of prohibition on alcohol in the United States. It's impossible to say to what degree prohibition affected the success of these games, but in theory, prohibition gave people one less thing to spend their money on, and that very well could have provided these games a boost. But as prohibition would come to an end in 1933 and the Great Depression raged on, the 5-cent asking price on many of these games became a wasteful expense. On top of that, these games were very expensive to manufacture, as well as expensive for shop owners to purchase. All of these factors left room for a cheaper alternative to flourish. It was October of 1930 when a carpenter from Youngstown, Ohio, named Arthur Paulin, decided to clean out his barn. Inside, he'd find a thick wooden board with holes and a few dozen nails in it. After tinkering with it for a few days, he had made his own Bagatelle-style game that he would call Wiffle Board. Given the Depression was still hitting everyone, he decided to use it as a Christmas gift for his daughter that year. The game quickly drew the attention of the neighborhood, and before long, kids were lining up along the side of his house to get a crack at the game. Thinking he might be onto something, Arthur acquired some partners and started Automatic Industries. He originally intended to create a high-end game cabinet for the home, but one of his partners suggested they make it a coin-operated machine instead, and that quickly proved to be the wiser of the options. The game gave players 10 balls for 5 cents with an objective we've become all too familiar with: score as many points as possible while rolling your ball around on a hill. Wiffle Board would quickly find success, as for a short time, the company averaged over 2,000 orders a month. However, similar to novelty-style games of the time, the high manufacturing costs made it difficult to keep up with high demand, and the 5-cent asking price left room for further competition in the form of games that were very similar. Pollen and Automatic Industries weren't the only ones working on a pin game during this time period. Around the same time, a janitor from Chicago named George Deprez would create an offshoot of Redgrave's Bagatelle with the simple intentions of entertaining his friends. Nick Burns, a man who worked in George's building, liked the game so much that he bought the rights to it and sold it under the name Whoopee. And while both games saw success, a combination of high manufacturing and purchase costs, cheaper competition, and the Great Depression would prevent them from reaching the heights of the games that would follow. 1931 would see a different pinball game take center stage as David Gottlieb enters the picture. Described as a charismatic showman with a knack for making games, David Gottlieb was the founder of D. Gottlieb & Company. Founded in 1927 and based out of Chicago, D. Gottlieb & Company made novelty-style games. In 1931, just 4 years into the company's life, they would strike it big with a game called Baffle Ball. A game that used no electricity, Baffle Ball cost 1 cent to play and gave players 7 balls. Players kept score in their head as they launched balls up and watched them fall back down the table in an attempt to score points by landing their ball in a pocket. Pins were scattered about the playing field and would deflect balls on the way down. Sound familiar? The whole ball rolling down a hill mechanic totally played out already. Of course, there were some key differences between Bagatelle and Baffle Ball, mainly that Baffle Ball was coin-operated, played with a plunger, and also featured a far greater slope than any version of Bagatelle we had seen to date. Gottlieb had himself a hit, and with it, countless players from across the country began pursuing high scores. Given the game didn't feature flippers, players would resort to bumping and shaking the table in an attempt to guide the ball into the appropriate scoring pocket, a method that became known as tilting. Baffle Ball machines cost $16.15 to purchase. Baffle Ball machines were priced about $1.50 higher than most of their competition. Baffle Ball sales would grow steadily until Davy G was moving units like a prime Walter White. At its peak, D. Gottlieb & Company shipped 400 Baffle Ball cabinets a day, riding the wave that was Baffle Ball near the top of the coin-operated amusement industry in the early to mid-1930s. The Ultimate History of Video Games Volume 1 by Stephen L. Kent, which I highly recommend, is a book I used extensively when researching for this series, particularly the early and pre-video game years. In it, Kent writes, Gottlieb, the first person to successfully mass-produce pinball cabinets in a factory, became the Henry Ford of pinball. His competitors worked out of garages and couldn't compete. And they couldn't. But, with proof that money could be made and a benchmark to strive for, many threw their hat in the ring, attempting to take the coin-operated amusement industry by storm with pinball games of their own. And while most of them couldn't compete, there were a few that broke through. Gottlieb found real competition in David Roccola, Ray Maloney, and Harry Williams. All 4 men were eventually inducted into the Amusement Industry Hall of Fame. David Roccola, founder of Roccola Manufacturing, saw his company produce slot machines and a variety of pin games that found modest success, though in the end, they'd become most known for their jukeboxes. I think it's important to note the relevant entertainment options of the time period, keeping in mind that by the year 1925, only half of all United States homes had electric power, so, for entertainment purposes, people left their house. A lot. For all I know, they still might. Baffle Ball or any of its pin game counterparts were commonly found on college campuses and in bars, usually not too far away from a jukebox. Jukeboxes had hit their stride and were becoming quite popular, and by the 1940s, 3/4 of records produced in America would end up in a jukebox. And while Baffleball was certainly a draw for some, if your bar didn't have music, you couldn't compete, making jukeboxes essential to establishments during this time period, and frankly, that still holds true in many cases today. Jukeboxes played a pivotal role for many of these manufacturing companies during this time period, serving as the backbone of the coin-op amusement industry in its early days. Further competition came in the form of Ray Maloney. Founder of Lion Manufacturing, Maloney's company would make a handful of their own novelty games before striking it big. As Baffleball grew in popularity, Maloney figured that Gottlieb and company couldn't possibly produce machines at the rate demand was growing, and saw that as an opportunity to carve out a piece of the market for himself. Taking cues from Baffleball and brightening up the board with more color, Maloney created a game called Ballyhoo in 1932, just 1 year after Baffleball's release. But it wasn't just Baffleball Maloney would borrow from in the creation of his new game. In fact, the name Ballyhoo, as well as the game's art design, originated in a men's humor magazine of the same name. Presumably, but not confirmed, a deal was struck with the publisher, allowing Maloney and company to continue to use the name. The game Ballyhoo was very successful. So much so, Maloney felt it best to release all future projects under the banner Bally Manufacturing. I've read some conflicting information as to whether this was a rebrand of Lion Manufacturing or just a subsidiary of Lion Manufacturing. Either way, Maloney would incorporate a new company called Bally Entertainment in 1968. Gottlieb's stiffest competition, however, may have come from none other than Stanford-educated engineer Harry Williams. Williams made his way into the coin-op amusement industry in 1932, earning $2 hourly as a games operator. An early goal of Williams was to make the game of pinball more difficult, so he invented a device that greatly limited players' ability to shake the table and influence the direction of the ball. Doing so in excess would knock the cabinet off the device, ending the game. He called it the stool pigeon, later changing the name to the tilting mechanism after hearing the players use the terminology. Williams tested this anti-tilting device on a new game he called Advance. This was the beginning of Automatic Amusements, a company created by Williams and located on Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles, California, a place still known to this day as Coin Machine Row. He would eventually sell the rights to Advance to Seaberg Manufacturing, where it really didn't do very well. There is some slightly conflicting information on the stool pigeon's invention as well. Williams is credited with the invention of the device. However, that same year, both Gottlieb and Ricola had machines on the market with similar anti-cheating devices, though from what I can tell, it was Williams' revised version that became the industry standard. With very little money to his name and minuscule royalties coming in from Advance, Williams knew that he had to make a big splash if he wanted to turn things around and become a real player in the coin-operated amusement industry. That big splash would come in the form of the first electromechanical pinball game ever created. The game was called Contact, the big drawing card being contact holes. When hit, the electromechanical pocket would shoot pre-existing shots into scoring pockets of greater value. While they weren't included initially, the scoring pockets would be upgraded with sound effects, and the anti-tilting mechanism would be added as well. All of these things together very quickly became the industry standard, as would automatic scorekeeping, which Williams began adding to games in 1934 using a clock counter. Williams would eventually be approached by Fred McClellan of Pacific Amusement Manufacturing Company about buying the rights to Contact. The two struck a deal, and Contact went on to become a mega hit, one that propelled Williams towards the top of the industry. During the early and mid-30s, Williams would design games and allow companies like Exhibit and Bally the rights to manufacture and distribute them in the Midwest and East Coast as long as they credited him with the design. By 1935, Williams was working for Dave Ricola. In the late 1930s, Williams would formally work for Bally. That would only last about a year before he took a job at Exhibit, before finally starting his own company in 1942 called Williams Manufacturing. In his career, Williams designed or worked on over 150 games. Addressing issues that plagued Wiffleboard and Whoopee, Williams, Ricola, Gottlieb, and Bally were all designing games that were cheaper to produce, cheaper to purchase, and cheaper to play, which led to pinball seeing a massive surge throughout the remainder of the Great Depression. Despite the development of strong competition within the industry, Gottlieb's focus was drawn to what he considered to be a growing problem. At the time, Gottlieb's biggest concern were slot machine manufacturers that had begun making payout machines. These machines combined pinball with gambling and proved to be a big problem for the industry, as it caught the attention of many politicians and lawmakers. Pinball games were widely viewed as games of chance, and these particular games of chance awarded real money or prizes to people with high scores. Pinball machines and jukeboxes, being entirely cash-operated, did not help their reputation either, as this all occurred during a time period where organized crime had grown substantially. And while there are many stories that link the mafia to jukeboxes, and much speculation that they controlled some pinball machines as well, I feel it's impossible to say for sure the degree to which the mafia influenced the industry during this time. Regardless, they had a perception problem all the same.
We're gonna know.
And as the decade would come to a close, Gottlieb's concern would prove warranted, and the entire coin-operated amusement industry's biggest fear was about to become reality. Politicians around the country saw payout machines as gambling and began lobbying to outlaw these machines based on mostly that, as well as some mob-related fluff thrown in to hammer the point home. Unfortunately for the coin-op industry, lawmakers didn't care to see the difference between payout machines and your standard pin game and began their crusade on both. To make matters worse, with war going on overseas, U.S. involvement would soon become inevitable. The United States would enter World War II in 1941. This would help lift the U.S. economy out of the Great Depression, as there were more jobs available, but those jobs were not made available to manufacture game cabinets. Manufacturers would stop producing games almost entirely to focus on aiding the United States in the war. And on January 21st, 1942, the ban hammer would drop. After months of lobbying against payout and pinball machines, citing that they were games of chance taking money from children, then New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia got what he had sought after for so long: an official ban on payout and pinball machines. Within 3 weeks, the police confiscated over 3,000 machines, the metal scrap being used to aid the US in its war against Nazi Germany. At least most of it was. Some of it ended up in the river, after Mayor LaGuardia smashed it to pieces with a sledgehammer. Yes, this guy takes victory laps like nobody I've ever met. As far as the rest of the country goes, as New York does, many would follow, and pinball bans began sweeping the nation. At this point, the industry needed a boost, and that boost would come from none other than D. Gottlieb and Company. In 1947, one of Gottlieb's engineers, Harry Mabs, invented the bumper flipper and put them into a new game he called Humpty Dumpty. 6 flippers in total were used in the game. Flippers would go on to be a salvation for pinball, as they left players directly interacting with the game, influencing its outcome like never before. With flippers, players now had a skill they could strive to become better at. This would lead to pinball bans being lifted across the country, with 2 glaring exceptions. The first being New York City, where pinball games remained banned until 1976, when a magazine editor named Roger Sharp got in front of the New York City Council and played pinball with the addition of these flippers. He proved he was able to aim his shot, making pinball far more game of skill than game of chance. The second exception was Kokomo, Indiana, who kept their pinball ban in place until 2016. Yup, 2016. When I first heard that, I thought they had simply forgotten the ban was in place at all, but after doing a little digging, I was able to confirm that they had forgotten the ban was in place at all. Former Kokomo Common Council member Steve Weichart, who served from 2015 to 2019, shed some light on the situation in an interview posted by the Indiana Public Media.
We had a whole laundry list of ordinances that were really outdated and archaic. You couldn't throw stones into the river. That could be punishable by a fine. One of them, actually defined what kind of explosives you could use in the city limits. And we thought we probably don't want to encourage that, so we went ahead and repealed those. There are all kinds of laws, even at the state level, even national level, that really should probably be repealed, that don't reflect what we do. And if they're not enforceable, then why have them on the books to begin with?
As an aside, if any of this makes you curious enough to research other laws we may have forgotten, please let me know what you find. Checking back in on Williams Manufacturing, borrowing a page from the I Want My Games to Be Legal playbook, Williams began adding flippers to his own games immediately in 1947, using them first in a game called Sunny. But it wasn't until Steve Kordek that the most efficient use for flippers was found. Steve Kordek was a designer for a company called Genco. Genco was a small company that needed to save money in any way that it could. Kordek, in his infinite wisdom, decided that his game only needed 2 flippers, and debuted the 1-row, 2-flipper setup in a game ironically titled Triple Action. In 1947, most pinball machines featured the 6-flipper setup, but in 1948, Kordek unveiled the 2-flipper setup at a trade show, and the 2-flipper model has been the industry standard ever since. It's tough to put into words why the change was so quickly adopted, but I think Steve Kordek sums it up as well as anyone could in a quote from Stephen L. Kent's Ultimate History of Video Games Volume 1, stating, "I worked for a small company, and I was always told to save money, and there was no way in the world I was going to use 6 flippers. We oughta put that on a t-shirt." In the end, pinball was saved, and would flourish for years to come with the addition of flippers. But electromechanical pinball is about as far as anyone could take their innovation during this time. Even mass-producing non-electromechanical games was thought impossible until Gottlieb did it. To make a computerized game and remain commercially viable, that wasn't even a thought in people's minds during this time period. First off, computers as we know them today didn't even take full form until 1941. Early computers often took up entire rooms and were not something companies were integrating into their entertainment products. Second, they were not very practical due to their incredibly high cost and massive size. But none of that would stop American physicist Edward Condon from making one anyways. Edward Condon was many things: physicist, pioneer in quantum mechanics, consultant for the National Defense Research Committee, helping develop radar for the United States, as well as a participant in the Manhattan Project for a short time. He was also a director of research at the Westinghouse Electric Company. Westinghouse Electric Company is a powerhouse in heavy industry, electrical production and distribution, consumer electronics, and much more. They were also a major exhibitor at the World's Fair in New York in 1940, and they needed a new idea for their exhibit that year. Condon suggested that they make a machine that could play a game called NIM. NIM involved 2 players taking turns removing objects from rows. Each turn, a player can only choose 1 row to take an object from and must remove at least 1 object from that row. Whichever player takes the last object from the board is the winner or loser, as the game can be played either way. Instead of using physical objects, Condon had players turning lights off in rows, facing off against the machine itself to be the last person turning a light off. There was no revolutionary technology in this beast of a machine, and technically speaking, it wouldn't qualify as a computer the way we know them today, but what it did have was early demonstrations of automated gameplay and the illusion of intelligent decision-making, as it was really nothing more than a fancy NIM playing calculator. This was a machine built with the sole purpose of entertaining people at the fair. He called it Nimatron. If you successfully beat the machine in NIM, you received a special token. Over 100,000 games of NIM were played at the fair. At the conclusion of the fair, the game was then displayed at the Boole Planetarium and Institute of Popular Science before eventually getting dismantled. It was a novel concept that was ahead of its time, and while not particularly revolutionary in terms of the technology used to build it, Condon innovated for innovation's sake, and the world needs people like that in order for boundaries to be pushed. In the years to come, a handful of innovators will push those boundaries even further, birthing an industry that has since become a multi-billion-dollar behemoth. And it all begins with a couple of vertical lines and a dream.